What you're watching unfold right now is not a headline, it is history being written in real time, and most Americans are only getting a fraction of the story. 640 Iranian missiles descending on southern Israel, 35 people dead, 800 wounded, and yet somehow the mainstream conversation in this country keeps reducing it to a simple equation of good guys and bad guys, right and wrong, strength and weakness. That is not analysis. That is theater. And if you're watching this channel, you're tired of theater. You want the truth. You want to understand what this moment actually means, not just for Israel, not just for Iran, but for the United States of America, for the global balance of power, for the entire architecture of the world order that was built after World War II. Because what we are witnessing right now is not a regional conflict. What we are witnessing is the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of the international system, and every American needs to understand exactly what that means. So let's start from the beginning and build this picture together, piece by piece, because the context matters enormously here, and without it, none of what you're seeing makes any sense at all. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran, stating their aim was to induce regime change and to target Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Now think about that for a second. Think about what it means for the United States of America, the country that wrote the rules of the post-World War II international order, that helped draft the United Nations Charter, that stood on stages around the world and lectured every other nation about sovereignty and the rule of law, to openly state that the goal of a military campaign is regime change in a sovereign country. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is a civilizational statement about who we are and what we are willing to do in this world. And before anyone wants to debate the morality of whether Iran deserved it or not, I want you to sit with that reality for a moment, because the precedent it sets echoes far beyond the borders of Iran. The joint U.S.-Israeli campaign evolved from initial strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of senior military figures into sustained, large-scale air operations across Iran, with hundreds of strikes recorded in at least 26 of Iran's 31 provinces, with Tehran as the most heavily targeted location. When you kill a country's supreme leader in the opening hours of a conflict, you are not conducting a surgical strike. You are not sending a message. You are going for the jugular. You are betting everything on one roll of the dice. And history tells us, from Iraq, from Libya, from Afghanistan, that decapitation of a government does not automatically produce the outcome you want. What it produces is chaos. What it produces is a power vacuum. What it produces is unpredictability. And unpredictability in a country that sits at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, is not a minor inconvenience. That is a global economic earthquake waiting to happen. Now, here's where Iran's response becomes critically important to understand, because the narrative being pushed in the United States is that Iran's retaliation was weak, that their missiles were mostly intercepted, that the Iron Dome and Arrow systems performed magnificently, and that Israel held the line. And some of that is true, but some of it is deeply misleading. Iranian missiles struck two communities in southern Israel, and Israel's military admitted it was not able to intercept the missiles that hit Dimona and Arad. And it was the first time Iranian missiles had penetrated Israel's air defense systems in the area around its nuclear facility. Read that again carefully. For the first time, Iranian ballistic missiles broke through the defensive perimeter around Israel's most sensitive nuclear installation. That is not a minor military statistic. That is a seismic shift in the strategic equation of this entire region. Because up until this moment, Israel's nuclear deterrent rested partly on the assumption of its invulnerability, on the belief that its facilities were protected, that its secrets were safe, that no adversary could reach what mattered most. That assumption is now gone. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf stated that if the Israeli regime is unable to intercept missiles in the heavily protected Dimona area, it is operationally a sign of entering a new phase of the battle. And he is absolutely right. This is what military professionals call a capability demonstration. Iran was not trying to destroy Dimona in that strike. Iran was proving that it could reach Dimona. It was sending a message written not in words, but in trajectory data and payload delivery. The message was clear. We can touch you where you thought we couldn't. Think about what that does to the entire strategic calculus of every decision maker in this conflict. Think about what it means for Netanyahu, for Trump, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff sitting in the Pentagon, because now every conversation about escalation has to include a variable that wasn't there before. The U.S. military confirmed it had struck more than 8,000 Iranian military targets, including 130 vessels, as part of an aerial campaign that also targeted Iranian vessels and drones in the Strait of Hormuz. 8,000 targets. That number should stagger you. That is not a limited strike. That is not a warning shot. That is an attempt at comprehensive destruction of a nation's military infrastructure. And yet, even after all of that, after the killing of their supreme leader, after the destruction of their missile launchers, their naval vessels, their nuclear facilities, Iran was still firing missiles into southern Israel. That tells you something profound about the nature of the Iranian state, about the depth of the revolutionary ideology that drives it, about the willingness of its people and its military to absorb punishment and keep fighting. And it should make every American ask a very serious question. What is the exit strategy here? Because here's what nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. There is no clean ending to this. Despite the unprecedented intensity of the military campaign, full capitulation encompassing the abandonment of Iran's nuclear and missile programs and its anti-US, anti-Israel posture remains unlikely, even after the killing of Khamenei. The experts who study this region for a living, the people who have spent their careers understanding Iranian politics and Iranian psychology, are telling us that the stated objectives of this war are not achievable through air power alone. You cannot bomb an ideology out of existence. You cannot destroy a 45-year-old revolutionary movement with missiles. You can degrade its capabilities. You can set it back, but you cannot erase the idea. And as long as the idea survives, the conflict continues. Now let's talk about what this means for the American people, because that's ultimately who I'm speaking to, and that's ultimately who has to live with the consequences of these decisions. Many of the U.S. military bases near Iran have been rendered all but uninhabitable due to Iran's strikes, and within the first 2 weeks of the war, Iran's attacks caused $800 million in damage to those bases, while a 27-March attack on Prince Sultan Air Base damaged multiple refueling aircraft and destroyed a Boeing E-3 Sentry, as well as wounding at least 15 U.S. soldiers. $800 million in damage to U.S. facilities, American soldiers wounded, American aircraft destroyed, and we are doing this, all of this, in a war that was not declared by Congress, in a conflict that the American people were never asked to vote on, in a military campaign whose objectives keep shifting every time a deadline passes or a negotiation fails. That is not democracy. That is not the constitutional system our founders designed. That is executive power running without a leash. And then there is the question of the Strait of Hormuz, which is perhaps the single most consequential geographical choke point on the planet for the global economy. Trump threatened destruction of Iran's infrastructure and civilization if they did not make a deal with the U.S. and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And eventually, the U.S., Israel, and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan beginning on April 8th, under which Iran would also reopen the strait. Think about the language being used there. Think about the word civilization. The President of the United States threatened to destroy the civilization of a country with 90 million people if they didn't comply with his demands. And whether you agree with the policy goal or not, you have to reckon with what that kind of language does to America's standing in the world. Because every nation on earth heard that threat. Every nation on earth that has ever been on the wrong side of American foreign policy heard that threat. And they are drawing conclusions about their own security arrangements, about whether they need to develop nuclear weapons of their own, about whether they need to align more closely with Russia or China, rather than depend on a United States that has demonstrated it is willing to threaten civilizational destruction to get what it wants. Iran accepted a 2-week ceasefire, which began on April 8th, followed by talks in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, but those talks failed to reach an agreement after 20 hours of negotiations, with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi saying the talks failed because of Washington's maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade, while U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said the U.S. needed to see an affirmative commitment that Iran would not seek a nuclear weapon. 20 hours of negotiations that produced nothing. And notice the language on both sides. Maximalism, shifting goalposts. These are not the words of parties moving toward a resolution. These are the words of parties who are still fundamentally at odds about the basic premises of the negotiation itself. Iran is saying, you keep changing what you want, and you're strangling us economically. At the same time, you're asking us to make concessions. The United States is saying, we need a clear commitment on the nuclear question, or nothing else matters. And both of those positions make complete sense from within their own frameworks, which is exactly why they are incompatible. After the failure of the Islamabad talks, Trump said he no longer cared about negotiations and announced a naval blockade of Iran to start on April 13th. A naval blockade. Do you understand what a naval blockade is under international law? It is an act of war. It has been an act of war since the 18th century. It is recognized under the laws of armed conflict as a hostile act that entitles the blockaded party to respond with force. So the United States government has now simultaneously declared that it wants a ceasefire and imposed a naval blockade on the same country it's trying to negotiate with. That is not diplomacy. That is coercion at gunpoint. And while coercion sometimes works in the short run, the history of international relations is littered with examples of coercion producing temporary compliance and long-term radicalization. At least 2,076 people have been killed by U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran since February 28th, including at least 240 women and 212 children, with more than 26,500 people injured. Those are the Iranian numbers. And I understand that some people watching this will immediately question those figures, will say Iranian state media can't be trusted, will argue that Iran exaggerates its civilian casualties for propaganda purposes, and that skepticism is reasonable. But even if you cut those numbers in half, even if you discount them by 75%, you are still talking about hundreds of civilians dead, thousands wounded in a country that did not attack the United States first. Iran did not strike American soil. Iran did not bomb American cities. Iran has been the target of a joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign aimed explicitly at regime change, and the people paying the price in blood are overwhelmingly ordinary Iranians who had no say in the decisions their government made. And this brings me to what I think is the deepest and most important question that we are not asking loudly enough in this country, and that is the question of moral consistency, because the United States has spent decades, literally decades, building an international reputation as the defender of the rules-based international order. We have sanctioned countries for violating territorial integrity. We have condemned military strikes on civilian infrastructure. We have lectured the world about the importance of proportionality in armed conflict, about the obligation to protect non-combatants, about the necessity of legal authorization for military action, and now we are running an air campaign against a sovereign nation aimed at regime change. We are threatening to destroy its civilization. We are imposing a naval blockade while simultaneously pretending to negotiate, and we are watching Iranian missiles strike southern Israeli cities and calling it escalation, while calling our own far larger offensive a response. The moral incoherence of that position is something that the rest of the world sees with absolute clarity, even if we can't see it ourselves. Since the start of the war with Iran on February 28th, Israel has dropped more than 15,000 bombs across the Islamic Republic, more than 4 times the amount used during the 12-day war in June 2025, and Israel's defense minister authorized a new series of targets for strikes in both Iran and Lebanon during the assessment, while also authorizing the call-up of 400,000 reservists for the war effort. 400,000 reservists, 15,000 bombs, and we are still in a phase where both sides describe what is happening as something short of a full-scale war. That tells you something deeply disturbing about the direction this conflict is moving if the ceasefire breaks down, because the weapons have not been put away, the reservists have not been sent home, the naval blockade is in place, and every day that passes without a durable political agreement is a day that increases the probability of the next escalation, and the next one, and the one after that. What we are watching in real time is the collision of 2 worldviews, 2 systems, 2 competing visions of how international order should work. One vision says that America and Israel have the right, even the obligation, to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons by any means necessary, including regime change, including economic strangulation, including military force applied without congressional authorization or UN Security Council approval. The other vision says that every state, regardless of its ideology, regardless of whether we like its government, has the right to sovereignty, to self-defense, to exist without being bombed into submission by a more powerful neighbor or its superpower patron. And I want to be honest with you, both of those visions contain some truth. That is what makes this so hard. That is what makes the easy slogans on both sides so inadequate. The 640 missiles that hit southern Israel are not just a military statistic. They are a reflection of a country that was attacked, that had its leader killed, that had its nuclear facilities bombed, and that decided, despite enormous costs, to fight back. Whether you think that response was justified or not, whether you think Iran's government is a legitimate representative of its people or not, the strategic reality on the ground is what it is. The number of Iranian missiles aimed at Israel was far lower than the numbers launched during the 12-day war in 2025, when Iranian forces commonly launched large barrages of missiles intended to overwhelm Israeli defenses. And analysts hypothesized that the reduction could be attributed to Israeli success in targeting launchers and storage locations in 2025 and joint U.S.-Israeli efforts during the 2026 conflict to eliminate as many as 3/4 of Iranian missile launchers. So Iran is degraded, significantly degraded, but it is not destroyed. And a degraded Iran that still has missiles capable of penetrating Israeli air defenses around Dimona is not a defeated Iran, it is a wounded Iran, and wounded animals are dangerous in ways that healthy ones are not. The question that every American should be asking their elected representatives every single day is this: what happens next? What is the plan for the day after the ceasefire? What is the plan for the political transition in Iran if the regime collapses? What is the plan for the global energy markets if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted for an extended period? What is the plan for the American soldiers who are right now sitting in bases across the Middle East that have been described as all but uninhabitable? What is the plan for the American taxpayer who is funding this campaign, whose costs have not been honestly presented to the public? These are not radical questions. These are the basic questions that any serious democracy should be demanding answers to before it sends its military into harm's way. And the fact that we are not demanding those answers, the fact that most of the conversation in this country has been reduced to partisan cheerleading for or against the operation without any serious strategic analysis, that is not just a media failure, that is a democratic failure, and it is one that history will judge us harshly for.